My son told me my love was worthless right there on the front lawn for the whole neighborhood to see. He stood by a sports car so shiny it hurt my eyes, a car that cost more than my little house. "I'll never need you again," he said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. My own son, Ethan. The neighbors peeked through their curtains, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves, but not a single soul stepped out to help me. I just stood there, my heart cracking into 1,000 tiny pieces. "Friend, before I go on, let me ask you, would you do me a kindness? Tap subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It helps me see just how far my story reaches." He tossed the keys in his hand. "I have 40 million reasons to never look back." He didn't even say goodbye, just got in that fancy car and drove away, leaving me in a cloud of dust and shame. I raised that boy by myself after his father, David, passed. I worked my fingers to the bone for him, for this, to be thrown away like yesterday's garbage. How does a mother's love lead to such a bitter end? How did my sweet boy become this cold, cruel stranger? It all started with a letter. It had been a quiet Tuesday morning in our little house in Maple Creek, Ohio. I was in the kitchen, humming an old tune and thinking about what to make for supper. Ethan, my son, was at the table looking through job ads in the local paper. Then the mail came. There was one letter that looked different, thick, creamy paper, with the name of a fancy New York law firm printed in the corner. It was addressed to Ethan. "Probably just junk mail," I said, setting it by his plate. But it wasn't. He opened it and his face went pale. It was from a lawyer. The letter said my late husband David's estranged brother, Richard, had passed away. Richard was a man who chased money and left family behind. We hadn't heard from him in 30 years. My heart ached a little for the brother David never got to make peace with. But then came the part that made Ethan stop breathing. He was named the sole heir, the only one to get Richard's entire fortune. "What does that mean?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. What on earth did a man like Richard even have left to give? The lawyer on the phone said the number, and it felt like a punch to the gut. $40 million, he said, as if he were telling us the weather. The words just hung there in our small living room, sucking all the air out. My first thought was a prayer of thanks, quickly followed by a deep, cold dread. I know what that kind of money can do to a person. "Ethan, we have to be careful," I warned, my voice barely a whisper. "This is a blessing, but it can also be a curse." But my son Ethan didn't hear me. It was like a switch had been flipped inside him. His eyes, usually so warm, looked hard and distant. Then the lawyer delivered the final blow. Plot twist 1. He said Richard's will had a special rule. For Ethan to get the money, he had to move away and manage the business assets himself. It was a trick from the grave, a way for a bitter old man to tear my son away from me. "This is my ticket out," Ethan said, looking right through me. "Out of this town, out of this life." He wasn't my son anymore. He was a stranger with $40 million. The money hadn't even arrived in his bank account, but my son Ethan was already a different person. He spent hours on a shiny new laptop, not looking for jobs in Ohio, but for apartments in a place called Beverly Hills. One afternoon, a delivery truck brought a mountain of boxes to our door. Inside were clothes fancier than anything I'd ever seen, with price tags that made my stomach clench. "Ethan, honey, what is all this?" I asked, holding up a shirt that probably cost more than our monthly grocery bill. He barely looked up from his phone. "It's who I am now, Mum." The next day, he came home with a screaming red sports car. The whole neighborhood came out to stare as he parked it in our driveway, a monster next to my old reliable sedan. I felt a blush of shame creep up my neck. He was showing off, trying to prove he was too big for our small town. He announced his leaving date like he was reading a grocery list, no emotion in his voice at all. I had 1 week left with my son, but was he already gone? The morning he left, a piece of my heart left with him. I woke up early like I always did when he was a boy, and packed him a lunch for the road, a turkey sandwich on wheat, an apple, a little bag of chips, a mother's simple gesture of love. When I handed him the brown paper bag, he looked at it like it was something dirty. "I'll just buy a jet," he scoffed, and let the bag fall from his hand onto the clean porch steps. The sandwich my loving hands had made was now just trash. I made one last try, my voice shaking. "Don't let this change who you are, Ethan. Don't forget where you came from." That's when he said the words that will haunt me until my dying day. He looked me right in the eye, his own son, and said, "With $40 million, I'll never need you or this dead-end town again." And then he was gone. The roar of his engine faded, and the silence it left behind was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. What does a mother do when her whole world drives away without looking back? My only window into my son's new life was his phone. Ethan, who wouldn't answer my calls, was posting pictures for the whole world to see. I'd sit in my quiet living room in Ohio, the one he grew up in, and watch him live a different life on a little screen. There were pictures of a giant, empty-looking house made of glass, parties on fancy boats with strangers who all had perfect teeth, and plates of food so small you'd need a magnifying glass to find them. He was showing off a life I didn't recognize. His captions always said things like "living the dream" or "never looking back." I'd text him, "I love you, honey. Please call me." But my messages would just sit there unread. He was building a new world for himself, one where his old mother didn't fit. Then, a new face started appearing in all his pictures. A stunning woman named Isabella, with eyes that looked as sharp and shiny as broken glass. Who was this woman, and what did she really want with my son? A few weeks after he left, Ethan called me. My heart leaped, thinking he missed me. But he didn't ask how I was. He wanted to tell me about a man he'd hired, a Mr. Alistair Sterling. Ethan said he was a financial advisor, a genius who handled money for movie stars and oil tycoons. He sounded so proud, so grown up. "He says I have a brilliant mind for investing, Mum," Ethan bragged. "He says you were smart to raise a son who isn't afraid of success." The words felt like a backhanded slap. My simple Ohio heart didn't trust it. It all sounded too smooth, too slick. "Honey, are you sure you can trust this man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't just hand your whole life over to a stranger." He sighed, a sound full of annoyance. "Mum, you don't get it. This isn't Maple Creek. He's important." Ethan told me this Mr. Sterling was putting his money into something called offshore opportunities. It sounded so official, but to my ears it just sounded far away and dangerous. How could I warn a son who refused to listen? Every time I looked at Ethan's pictures online, that woman, Isabella, was there. She was always clinging to his arm, wearing dresses that cost a fortune and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. In his next short phone call, her name was all he could talk about. "Isabella says I'm a visionary, Mum. She gets it," he said. "She says I have to spend money to make money. She even thinks Mr. Sterling is a genius." It felt like she was just echoing all the bad ideas he already had, making them sound smarter. She was helping him become a stranger. He told me Isabella had helped him pick out a painting for his big glass house. It cost $1 million. $1 million for some paint on a canvas. I felt sick. "Ethan, are you saving anything for a rainy day?" I asked, my voice small. He just laughed. "Mum, there aren't any rainy days when you're this rich." I looked at another picture of them, him smiling wide and her looking at the camera. Was this woman his partner, or was she just helping him spend his future? One night the phone rang and it was Ethan. He wasn't calm and bragging, he was angry, his voice sharp and loud. "Can you believe this?" he shouted into the phone. "The bank! They had the nerve to call me with a fraud alert because I was making a big investment. A fraud alert, like I'm some kind of criminal." My heart pounded in my chest. A fraud alert. That sounded serious. "Oh, Ethan, maybe they were just trying to protect you." "What was the investment?" I asked, trying to understand. He completely ignored my question. "I told that little teller exactly who I was and to push the transfer to Dubai through. You should have heard how fast she apologized." He was so proud of himself for bullying a bank employee who was just doing her job. He thought he had won some kind of victory, but I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. My son had just been handed a lifeline, a bright red warning flag, and he had torn it to shreds out of pure arrogance. He hadn't just approved a transfer, he had shut the last locked door on his own safety. One afternoon there was a knock on my door. It was Mark, my son Ethan's best friend since they were old enough to ride bikes. He was a good boy, with kind eyes just like his mother, who I'd see every Sunday at church. He stood on my porch twisting a baseball cap in his hands. "Mrs. Miller," he started, his voice full of worry. "I called Ethan. I tried to talk to him. He's not the same guy." My heart ached to hear it from someone else, to know I wasn't just a crazy, worrying mother. Mark told me he'd seen the flashy pictures and heard the pride in Ethan's voice, and it scared him. He tried to remind Ethan of home, of the good times they had just fishing at Miller's Pond. "He told me I was jealous," Mark said, his eyes on the floor. "He said I was stuck in the past, and that I should just leave him alone." Ethan had pushed away the last piece of his real life, the last friend who remembered the boy he used to be. Mark promised me he wouldn't give up, but I knew my son. When he shuts a door, he locks it. How do you save someone who doesn't want to be saved? I was at the grocery store trying to decide between 2 brands of canned tomatoes when Ethan called. It was the first time in weeks. He sounded excited, like a kid on Christmas morning. He wasn't calling to check on me. He was calling to brag. "Mr. Sterling just got me into a huge deal, Mum. We're talking rare earth mineral rights, things you wouldn't understand." My hand froze over the tomatoes. Mineral rights? It sounded like something out of a movie. I clutched the phone tighter, leaning against my shopping cart. "Ethan, your father and I, we built our savings with a simple plan at the town bank. It sounds like gambling." He let out that same annoyed sigh. "It's not gambling, Mom. It's vision." Then he said the words that made my blood run cold. He said Mr. Sterling told him to sell off all the safe, boring stocks his Uncle Richard had owned for years. He called them dead money. My heart just sank into my shoes. He wasn't just spending his fortune, he was selling off its very foundation. What on earth happens when the foundation is gone? The next time Ethan called, he was laughing. It was a brittle, ugly sound. "You won't believe this, Mom," he said. "I was at this big charity party with Isabella, and I overheard some old guy talking. He called Mr. Sterling a cowboy, said he was dangerous." A little flame of hope flickered in my chest. Maybe this would be the thing that opened his eyes. Maybe he would finally see the truth. But then he kept talking, and that little flame died out, leaving nothing but smoke. "But Isabella, she's so smart. She set me straight right away," he continued, still laughing. "She told me that's what small men call a giant. She said they're just jealous they don't have his guts." He truly believed it. He thought the warning was a compliment, a sign that he was on the right path. He was twisting poison into medicine. And in that moment, listening to my son laugh at his own rescue party, I truly believed I might never get him back. Not really. What was that woman, Isabella, turning him into? The phone rang long after midnight, ripping me from a restless sleep. It was Ethan, but his voice was thin and shaky, like a little boy who'd just seen a monster in his closet. "Mum," he whispered, "something's wrong." He said he got a margin call. I didn't know what those words meant, but I could hear the terror behind them. He said the investments had all gone bad at once, and that he needed to find a huge amount of cash right away, or he would lose everything. "What does Mr. Sterling say?" I asked, my own voice trembling in the dark. "He told me not to panic," Ethan said, sounding a little breathless. "He said fortune favours the bold and that I need to double down, to put the rest of my money in to shore up my position." My blood ran cold. It sounded like a trap. It was like telling a drowning man that the best way to get to shore was to drink the ocean. He hung up the phone, sounding a little bit like his old confident self again. Sterling's words had been a poison that sounded like a cure. My son was standing at the edge of a cliff and his advisor had just told him the best way down was to jump. He called me the next day from his glass house in California while I was kneeling in my little garden, pulling weeds. He was talking fast, trying to sound sure of himself, but I could hear the fear underneath. "Isabella is right here with me, Mom. She's holding my hand," he said. "She says this isn't a setback. She says this is a test of my character, a moment that will define me as a man of action." I dropped my trowel in the dirt, my hands shaking. This wasn't a test of character. This was a house fire. "Ethan, please, that's not your character. That's your future. It's your safety net," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Don't do it." But it was like he couldn't even hear me. Isabella's whispers were louder than his mother's screams. The line went quiet for a moment. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "It's done." I sent the last of it. All I could hear was the wind in the trees and the sound of my own heart breaking. He thought he was saving his investments, but I knew. I just knew in my soul. He had just sold his future. A few days later, Mark called me. He sounded tired and defeated. He told me he couldn't stand it anymore. So he bought a plane ticket and flew all the way to Los Angeles to try and save his friend. "I found some things online, Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice low. "Stories about a con man in Florida who used the same words as Sterling. I had to try and warn him." Mark found Ethan in the middle of a huge, loud party at his mansion. He pulled Ethan aside and begged him to just listen, to freeze his accounts, to call a real lawyer. My heart swelled with love for that boy, for trying so hard. "What did Ethan do?" I asked, holding my breath. Mark's voice broke. "He had his security guards throw me out," he whispered. "He screamed at me in front of everyone. He said to go back to Ohio where I belonged." I started to cry, silent tears running down my face. Then Mark told me Ethan's last words to him were, "You're dead to me." Dead to him. Was that what I was too? The last time I spoke to the man my son had become, he called me from a world away. He was high on hope again, his voice full of that fake confidence that had become so familiar. "This is it, Mom. The big one," he said. "Mr. Sterling is putting my last bit of money into a humanitarian tech fund. It's for a good cause. We're helping people." I was in my kitchen, my hands covered in flour, and I felt my whole body go still. A charity? It sounded too good, too clean for the likes of Mr. Sterling. "Isabella says I'm not just going to be rich again," he went on. "She says I'm going to be a philanthropist." That big, fancy word sounded so wrong coming from his mouth. "Ethan," I said, my voice pleading, "that word doesn't mean anything if you don't have a penny to your name. Please, don't do this." He told me the wire transfer was going through that very minute. "By tomorrow I'll be a hero," he said before hanging up. I sank into a kitchen chair, the smell of burnt cookies suddenly filling the air. I had a terrible feeling that my son's life was about to burn down too. The next phone call came in the middle of the night. It was Ethan, but the voice was one I hadn't heard since he was a little boy who'd fallen from a tree. It was pure terror. "He's gone, Mom," he sobbed, his words all tangled up. "The office. It's empty. There's nothing here." He'd gone to see Mr. Sterling, but the whole place was cleaned out. The fancy desk, the leather chairs, the name on the door, all of it had vanished. "It's like he was never even here," he cried. My own heart was pounding, but all I could feel was a wave of love for my broken boy. "Oh, honey. Oh, my poor boy, I'm so sorry," I whispered into the phone, wishing I could reach through the line and hold him. He was rambling, barely making sense. "I have to find Isabella. She'll know what this is all about. She's at the house. She wouldn't let this happen." He hung up to go find her, to cling to the last piece of his fantasy world. But a new, colder fear gripped my heart. What if she was never there to help him in the first place? An hour later, he called back. The panic was gone. In its place was a silence so dead and hollow it scared me more than his tears. "She's gone," he whispered. His voice was flat, empty. He told me he found Isabella in their bedroom, calmly packing a beautiful suitcase. There was no surprise on her face when she saw him, no worry, just a cold, bored look. I asked her, "You knew?" And she just smiled at me, Ethan said, his voice cracking. Then he told me what she said next, the words that would surely poison his heart forever. She told him it was all just a job, that he was the easiest person she had ever tricked because he was so desperate to be important. Plot twist 3. As she walked out the door, she looked back at him and said the cruelest thing of all. "I'm the one who found you, you know. I read a story about your inheritance online and knew you were the perfect target. He wasn't just unlucky. He was chosen, hunted, and the woman he thought he loved had been the one to set the trap." He was still on the phone with me, his voice a hollow echo in his big, empty house. "I'm looking at my bank account, Mum, on the computer screen," he whispered. I sat in my worn-out armchair in Ohio, clutching the receiver, my knuckles white. I waited, my heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. "What is it, honey?" I finally asked, my own voice trembling. "What's there?" There was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the line, a silence so heavy it felt like I was drowning in it. Then he spoke, and his voice was nothing but a dry rustle of leaves. $73, he said, and 14 cents. He repeated the number, as if the words themselves were foreign, impossible. "That's all, Mum. It's all gone." $40 million, a king's ransom, had vanished into thin air, leaving behind less money than I keep in my cookie jar for emergencies. He just kept whispering, "It's all gone," over and over. But I knew in that moment, it wasn't just the money he was mourning. What do you call the sound a soul makes when it finally breaks? I didn't hear from Ethan for 2 days. I just sat by the phone and prayed. Then I found out where he was. I was watching the evening news trying to distract myself when a familiar face flashed onto the screen. It was my son, my Ethan. A handsome picture of him from one of his fancy parties, smiling with a glass of champagne. But the words the news anchor was saying were a nightmare. They called the charity fund a giant scam, a fraud, and they called my son the millionaire fool, the biggest victim of them all. My phone started ringing. It was my neighbour, Martha, her voice dripping with that fake sympathy that's worse than cruelty. "Oh, Sarah, you poor thing," she said. "Did you see the news? That picture of your Ethan is everywhere." My shame was so great I could barely breathe. Plot twist 4. Then the news anchor said the charity party was still going to happen, but now they were turning it into a warning event about getting scammed. And my son, my broken son, was their poster boy for being a fool. They were going to use his ruin as entertainment. Weeks went by with nothing but a crushing silence. I called his phone until it was disconnected. I left messages that were never heard. Every waking moment was a prayer. Every dream was a nightmare. I thought I had lost him for good. Then one evening the phone rang, and it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a rough, tired voice I barely knew said, "Mum?" It was him. It was my boy. He sounded like he had been sleeping on rocks. "They took the house," he said, his voice flat. "They took the car. I slept in a shelter last night, Mum." A homeless shelter. My son, who had worn $1,000 shoes, was sleeping in a room full of strangers with nothing to their name. The tears I had been holding back finally came, a flood of love and pain. "Oh, Ethan," I cried, "where are you? Come home, just please come home." I wanted him to say yes. I prayed he would. But all he said was, "I can't. Not yet. I can't let you see me like this." Then the line went dead. My son was homeless in a giant city, and he was too ashamed to come home. After that terrible phone call, the silence returned, heavier than before. Months passed. The leaves on my maple tree turned red, then fell, and the first snow began to cover the ground. I thought my heart would break from the not knowing. Then One day, a letter appeared in my mailbox. It was a real letter. On creased paper, the envelope smudged with dirt. The handwriting was his. It had no return address, but the postmark was from some little town in Colorado. I tore it open with trembling hands. "Mum," it said, "I'm working now, washing dishes at a greasy spoon diner. My hands are cracked and sore, but it feels real. It feels like I'm finally paying for what I did." He wrote that every dollar he earned felt more valuable than the millions he'd lost. He was sleeping in a tiny room above the diner and eating leftover food, but he said he was learning what it meant to be a man, the way his father had always tried to teach him. The letter was the most beautiful and painful thing I had ever read. He was alive. But he was still out there, all alone, and the letter ended with, "I'm not done paying my debts." The seasons changed again. Winter melted into a wet, hopeful spring. I spent most evenings on my front porch, just watching the cars go by, a foolish part of me thinking one of them might be him. One night, as the fireflies were beginning to blink in the twilight, a figure turned the corner and started walking up my street. He was just a silhouette at first, but there was something in the way he walked, a familiar slump in his shoulders that made my heart stop. He got closer, and I could see his face in the soft porch light. It was my son. He stopped at the bottom of my steps, looking up at me. He was so thin, and his eyes were full of a deep, weary sorrow. He looked like a traveller who had crossed the whole world on foot to get here. He just stood there on the sidewalk, not saying a word, like a lost ghost who had finally found his way home. I stood up from my rocking chair, my own legs shaking. After all this time, all this pain, what do you even say to the son who broke your world in two? I looked at my boy, standing there with the weight of the world on his shoulders, and all the anger I ever had just melted away. There was no room for "I told you so." There was only room for my son. I didn't say a word. I just walked to the screen door and held it open wide. That simple movement was all it took. His face crumpled and a sob tore through him, a sound of such pain and regret that it brought tears to my own eyes. He stumbled up the steps and fell into my arms. "Mom," he choked out, his face buried in my shoulder. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I held him tight, my boy who was now a man, and rocked him back and forth like I did when he was small. "I know, honey," I whispered into his hair. "I know. You're home now. That's all that matters." He cried for a long, long time, washing away all the pride and the cruelty. I led him to the old sofa in the living room. The storm was finally over. But as we sat there in the quiet house, I wondered, can a life, once so completely shattered, ever truly be put back together again? A few weeks after Ethan came home, he was desperate to make himself useful. One rainy Saturday, he decided to clean out the attic, a dusty place full of old memories I hadn't touched in years. He came down an hour later, holding a small sealed box that the lawyers had sent after my husband's brother Richard passed away. We had never opened it. Inside, tucked into an old book, was a letter. It was handwritten, addressed to me. We sat at the kitchen table, and I read the words from the grave out loud. "Sarah," it began, "I know my brother David would have been too proud to ever take a penny from me. We let money ruin our family once. I pray it doesn't happen again." My hands started to shake. The letter explained everything. Plot twist 5. Richard had left the money to Ethan, hoping my son would be the bridge to heal the family he had broken. "This money isn't for sports cars," he wrote. "It's to give the boy a good start, to take care of you, to fix what I broke." The letter fell from my hands. The fortune was never a curse. It was a desperate final apology. And my son had squandered not just the money, but his great-uncle's last wish. Ethan just stared at the letter on the table, his face as white as a sheet. All this time he had been grieving a life of luxury. Now, a much heavier grief fell upon him. It was the grief of a moral failure. He hadn't just been a fool, he had failed the dead. "I didn't just lose the money," he whispered, his voice thick with a new kind of shame. "I lost his last wish." I failed him, Mum. I failed Dad's memory. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I put my arm around him. It was time for a mother's love, but also a mother's wisdom. The money and the way he gave it, that was your uncle's mistake, I said gently. What you do now, Ethan, from this day forward, that is on you. You can't change what you did, but you can live a better life starting right now. He looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a fire I hadn't seen before. Not the fire of greed, but the fire of purpose. You're right, he said. I have a different kind of debt to pay now. My son, Ethan, started to rebuild his life, not with money, but with sweat. He got a job at the local hardware store, stocking shelves and sweeping floors. The owner, Mr. Henderson, looked him up and down on his first day. You sure you know how to work, millionaire? He grumbled. Ethan just looked him in the eye and said, No, sir, but I'm a fast learner. The whispers around town followed him everywhere, from the grocery store to the post office. But Ethan never flinched. He just did his work, head held high. He used his small paycheck to enroll in a night class at the community college. He was trying to learn about the very thing that had destroyed him, money. One weekend, I found him in his father's old, dusty workshop in the garage, running his hand over the saws and hammers. He looked at me, a small, sad smile on his face. Dad knew how to build things that last, didn't he? He said. He was holding an old, worn-down hammer, but he looked like a king who had just found his crown. Was it possible he could build a new life from the wreckage of his old one? Life had found a quiet, gentle rhythm. Ethan worked at the store, studied at night, and we'd have supper together every evening. The peace was a blessing. Then one day, a phone call shattered it. A man with a serious voice asked to speak to Ethan. He said he was from the FBI. My blood ran cold. The man explained that they had caught them. Alistair Sterling and Isabella. They had been running the same scam in another country and were finally behind bars. But to make sure they stayed there, they needed testimony from their victims. They needed Ethan. I saw the colour drain from my son's face. To face those two people again, to speak about the deepest shame of his life in a courtroom for everyone to see. It was a terrible thing to ask. The agent on the phone said, His story could be the thing that puts them away for good. Ethan looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the scared boy he had been, but also the strong man he was becoming. He took a deep breath and spoke into the phone, his voice firm and clear. Yes, he said, I'll do it. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the back of a cold courtroom, my hands clenched in my lap. I watched my son walk to the witness stand. He looked so handsome in his simple borrowed suit. Then I saw them. Sterling and Isabella. They sat at a table looking small and pale and ordinary. All the wicked magic they had woven around my son was gone. They were just two tired, greedy people in cheap clothes. Ethan sat down, looked the judge in the eye, and told his story. He didn't make excuses. I was a fool, he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. I was arrogant and greedy, and I wanted to be someone I wasn't. They saw that, and they used it. He looked over at them, not with hatred, but with a strange, sad pity. My mistakes were my own, but they don't give anyone the right to destroy lives for profit. When he was done, he walked away from the stand and came to sit beside me. We held hands, listening as the prosecutor listed all the other families they had ruined. Justice was no longer just about us, it was about everyone they had ever hurt. A year has passed since that day in the courtroom. Sterling and Isabella were found guilty, sent away for a long, long time. The news brought us a quiet sense of peace, a final closing of a painful door. Ethan finished his classes at the community college and got a letter in the mail last week. He's been accepted to a 4-year university. He's going to become a financial counsellor to help regular, hard-working folks like us protect their savings from sharks like the ones who preyed on him. He is turning his deepest wound into his greatest strength. Sometimes I find him in his father's old workshop, covered in sawdust, a peaceful smile on his face. We built a kitchen table together last month, and it's the most beautiful thing in my house. The other day, looking at the sturdy table we had made, I felt a swell of pride so deep it almost hurt. "You know," I said, running a hand over the smooth wood, "your father would be so proud." Ethan looked at me, his eyes clear and bright. "I hope so, Mom," he said. "I finally feel like I'm building something that will last."